We're going to start. That direct democracy in action. None of this representative stuff. Okay, so I want to welcome you all to Black Hat here. It's our largest ever, you may notice, in terms of both attendee numbers, number of sponsors, and number of speakers. To accommodate this, we added a fifth track of speaking, which is going to be a little difficult to find since I don't think we've used it for at least 3 or 4 years. It's downstairs at the bottom of the escalators, so you can either take the elevators, go down those escalators and find it. That's where the mysterious fifth track is going to be. Okay, so I want to apologize for the early hour. We try not to start this early usually because we are in Las Vegas. But we have so many speakers this year, so many people have submitted. We turned down over 200 presentations. And so we hope we pick the right ones. But every year we take a risk and accept ones that we're not too sure on, but we're hoping to strike gold. But you can't do that unless you drill in some weird places. So what we really need you guys to do is perform some feedback. Let us know, what happened with the presentations, what you enjoyed, and what you didn't. If you haven't been to a Black Hat before, you know that we pride ourselves on trying to have viciously vendor-neutral presentations that are technical to very technical. And so to this end, I'm expecting you guys to perform some kind of karate chop action against anybody that appears to be violating this rule. If they appear to be pitching a product or kind of too closed-minded, you're there to remind the speakers that they're here to help educate you. They're not here just to preach at you and then walk away. And so to that end, we encourage our speakers to attend and stay the whole sessions, to be at all the breaks, to really spend some time getting to know you. And I think that's one of the only ways you're really going to learn. I mean, there's a lot of social networking that goes on at this show, but we want the speakers to really be a part of that. And I think Adam Shostak pointed out that the speakers really enjoy talking to other interesting people, and so if nobody's talking to them, they'll talk to each other. So if you see like a little circle of speakers in like some kind of hacky sack circle, that's just because nobody's bothered to interrupt them yet. So don't be turned off if you see a bunch of speakers talking to each other, just because they haven't found anybody else to talk to at the moment. Let's see, also new this year, we've added this passport game with some of the vendors and sponsors, and you'll see it in the little pull-out. You have it right there, I think, in the little pull-out section. I'm supposed to point that out because it is new, and we don't want everybody to miss it. There are prizes involved, so there's free swag involved. Also, another way to win free stuff, admittance to future Black Hats, is perform speaker feedback. We select 3 of them, and winners get things from free admittance to future shows to propaganda, T-shirts, free marketing materials, CDs of speakers, past speakers, those kinds of things. So please provide feedback. It's really our own way of knowing what's going on. Also, we've added this thing. I didn't know what to call it, so I called it the 4 corners. I talk about it a little bit at the beginning of the book. And we've gotten feedback in the past that people wanted bird of a feather sessions. They wanted something to meet, a mechanism to meet other people. So what we did is we created 4 topics, and we're sticking signs in basically 4 corners of the area out here during the reception. And if those topics interest you, just hang out near them and you'll find other people like yourself. If topics don't interest you, just don't stand near the 4 corners. And then we're going to try to seed the corners with speakers and other people that are interested or authoritative in those topics, and hopefully that'll form the seeds of some good conversations. If it doesn't work this year, I'll subject you to it again next year. And then if it doesn't work next year, we won't do it again. So I want to see by a show of hands of people in the audience, how many people heard about this conference from word of mouth or here because of something a colleague or somebody said? How many people are here from advertising? Something you read in a magazine, something you read in a news group. That's all my marketing dollars in effect right there. I'm seriously starting to question this whole concept of advertising and marketing. I think word of mouth is my friend. Could probably buy a Porsche for the marketing dollars. Okay, how many people in the audience have seen your mandate and or your budget for security functions over the last year decrease? How many people have seen it increase? and then stay the same. So more increases than decreases. Interesting. How many people would like to see the presentations here be the same or less technical than you've experienced in the past, if you've attended in the past or maybe read through the book? How about the same? About the right level right now? And more technical? Man, that's tough to fill. There's only so many bright people in the world that can also speak. And so we try to get a line on them all, but okay, and this is one we're trying to figure out also to be a little more friendly to the environment. We really want to find out how many people would be happy with receiving all the materials only on CD and not get a printed program. Okay, how many people want the option of having both? Okay, and how many people want us to only give you the book? Right? So what we'll probably do in the future is when you sign up, we'll give you an option to say if you want the CD or the book and the CD, and if you pick no, we'll know how to print less books so we don't have so many surplus left over. It still costs us the same amount of money as the way printing works, but at least we won't have so many spares laying around, which would be great. Okay, so a couple of notes. Turn off your cell phones. You can't see them, but we have secret devices installed in the ceiling which will fire small paintballs at you should your phone go off. And my liability insurance isn't fully covered right now, so I don't want to risk any lawsuits over that. So just turn them off right off the bat. That would be great. I want to thank everybody for making it the biggest year ever. The speakers, the most number of speakers we've ever had, for taking the time to fill out the presentation forms and put up with our aggressive policy. I want to thank all the sponsors for making it possible. I'm kind of interested to see if PwC and E&Y get into some kind of, brawl over accounting practices. Final four out there, we've got two of them. With the two could collide, we could probably settle this whole match right now in one weekend. And also you attendees for getting up so early. Okay, enough of all that stuff. I'm going to introduce our first keynote speaker. You may not remember it, but back at DEF CON 2, he gave a great speech. Back when he was in the middle of a running street fight with the US government. Though Philip Zimmermann does not really need an introduction, I see some people in the audience who may not have been born when he really started to get noticed. Besides being known for writing pretty good privacy, PGP, in 1995, Time magazine named him one of the top 50 most influential people for this whole interweb internet thing that was coming down the pike. In 2000, InfoWorld named him one of the top 10 innovators, and in 2001 he was inducted into the CRN Industry Hall of Fame. He was under a 3-year criminal investigation for export restrictions of his crypto technology, which went nowhere. But he did say, man, this is grueling. He said they ran an aggressive counter campaign against the government, and he did press interviews every day for 3 years. That's pretty brutal. But he's successful, so maybe that's what it takes nowadays. Okay, with that said, I'd like to have a round of applause for Philip Zimmermann.
This is for tall people. Okay. Well, one thing I'm going to do early in the talk is to try to get a few questions rather than wait till the end, because that makes it more likely that I'll talk about stuff you're interested in. Well, I got in this because of my political activism. PGP originally was a human rights project. But during the 3-year criminal investigation, my defense lawyers wouldn't let me talk about PGP being a human rights project because pivotal to the prosecution's case was my intentions. Did I intend it to be exported? And if I talked about it being a human rights project, then that would be the same as admitting that I wanted it to be exported, since presumably most of the human rights violations were happening outside the U.S. That was then. I'm not sure if that's true now. But, you know, the statute of limitations has run out, so I can say anything I want now. So that's really what the reason was. I did talk about at the time that it was also for domestic consumption to, you know, to protect privacy at home and for grassroots political organizations. In fact, I got the idea back in the 1980s when I was a peace activist. We were working on the nuclear weapons freeze campaign, and at that time, grassroots political organizations were kind of in an adversarial role with the White House. And so I felt that these kinds of organizations needed to have some protection for their mailing lists and databases and communications on bulletin board systems. There really wasn't much of an internet then. So, so that's really where PGP came from. And because of that being where it came from, it meant that the design of it was a different design than commercially available encryption software at the time, because the threat model was different. When you have a different threat model, you design your product in a different way. And so commercially available encryption software at that time, the main threat model was to protect your business secrets from your competitors. And businesses' competitors had no significant cryptanalytic capabilities. Therefore, 56-bit DES was adequate. That was in 1991. But if you're trying to do this for human rights, if you look at it in the Cold War context of 1991, and actually I started working on the design of this in 1984 and started writing code on it in 1986. In that context, the major governments could be brought to bear to the national technical means of major governments might be applied to break this stuff if it was used in countries with human rights problems. So that meant that the design of it had to be a completely uncompromising design. 56-bit DES wasn't going to do it. And so in the decade since that time, the repurposing of some of the assets of major governments' intelligence apparatus was to be applied to economic intelligence, you know, to be able to spy on businesses in the global economy. And so over the decade, the threat model for businesses gradually changed in such a way that it began to more closely resemble the human rights threat model. Namely, that the opponents might be intelligence agencies of major governments. So now PGP is a commercial product. I know I'm not supposed to talk about products, it's supposed to be vendor neutral, but gee, you know, I spent a lot of time on PGP, and that's what people know me for, so it's kind of... But you know, there's other products that use the same protocol. There's Hushmail for web-based encryption. There's a company in Belgium called Veritas that does a Unix command line version, and you can, you know, get something from them when it's a lot cheaper than the stuff from Network Associates. Gee, why does everybody laugh when I say Network Associates? This is a pretty knowledgeable audience, I see. That was kind of a dark chapter in PGP's history. But the dark times are over. PGP is back. You know, I used to get a lot of email from people that worried about PGP falling into the wrong hands, you know, like Network Associates buying PGP, which they did because I sold it to them because we ran out of money and we were about to go bankrupt. So what choice did I have, right? But, you know, all this hand-wringing, this concern, wasn't, I mean, it was all about people worried about it having a back door put in it. Well, Network Associates wasn't going to put a back door in PGP. You know, they wouldn't know how to put a backdoor in PGP. And it was my engineering team that was, in a position to either put a backdoor in it or guard it from other people trying to put a backdoor in it, and guess which one they would rather do. So the real problem with it falling into the wrong hands, and in fact it did fall into the wrong hands, was how it was sold and how it was marketed, or how it wasn't sold or marketed. And so it was mothballed, and then it was rescued by a new company, PGP Corporation, and now it's doing very well. Now it's it's making money, which is better than it was when in the first time around, where it lost money, and it also lost money under Network Associates. So this is a significant improvement. One of the problems that we had was the ease of use issue. There was a university that came out with a study called "Why Johnny Can't Encrypt." Maybe some of you read that paper, and it has to do with the complexity of public key infrastructure, and actually it focused on PGP, but it applies to all kinds of public key products. And the problem is your mom can't use PGP, because if you have to understand how public key cryptography works to use it, then that's too complicated. If you have to understand about certification of keys, trust models, why you got to get people to sign your keys, that's too complicated. So for a long time, the engineers at PGP wanted to do something about this, but there was never any money to fund a major project to do something. But now there's a new product they're coming out with that lets people in a large enterprise have all their email encrypted and decrypted without any training, in fact, without them even realizing that there's encryption taking place. So it can't get any easier than that. If it gets to the point where you don't even know it's happening, then that's ease of use. So look for that when it comes out. I don't know how much I'm allowed to talk about it, but you can always ask the company. Anyway, if you, one thing that somebody asked me to do before I came up here this morning was they wanted to have some PGP war stories. So I guess I'll have to tell you some PGP war stories. One of my favorite aspects of the PGP project was how we got the source code out of the country. In the early days, it was just a matter of publishing it on the internet, and then it gets out of the country. The problem with that is that it's liable to get you indicted for violating the Arms Export Control Act. So new methods had to be developed, especially if they're actually looking at you to see if if they're preparing to indict you. Then any new methods you have for getting the source code out of the country had better not resemble the old methods that got you in trouble. So we came up with the idea of publishing books with source code in an OCR font that could be scanned in Europe, with checksums on every line. It was a really good checksum scheme too, Actually, the publishing in a book was originally started with MIT, but for entirely different reasons. It had nothing to do with getting source code out of the country, because at that time the source code was already outside the country. But it was actually part of the defense effort. Bruce Schneier had a book, Applied Cryptography, which many of you have read, I'm sure. And in the appendix of that book, there was a lot of source code. So Phil Karn at Qualcomm took a copy of Bruce Schneier's book and applied for a commodities jurisdiction from the State Department, asking that if it can be exported. And they said, of course it can be exported, dummy. It's a book, Don't ask us these stupid questions. So they gave him the commodities jurisdiction. What they didn't realize was that Phil Karn had a dastardly plan that 5 minutes after they gave him the commodities jurisdiction, the CJ, he applied for another CJ, but this one for a floppy disk, containing the same source code that was in the book. It was exactly the same source code that was in the book. And when they saw this, they kind of blanched and said, "Oh my God, we've been had." And they said, no, you can't have a CJ for this. This is software. And he said, but it's the same as in the book. In fact, it's less than the book because it's only the appendices of the book, just the source code. And they still said no. So he appealed it through administrative appeals, and they kept saying no. So he sued them. So they were actually defendants in a civil lawsuit. And MIT Press approached me, and they wanted me to do something with PGP. And I said, well, how about if we publish the source code in a book? And they said, okay. And so they published the source code for PGP 262 in a book, which was the current version at that time. And it was a very boring book, let me tell you. The only thing it had in it that it was readable was the introduction. And the idea here was that we would apply for a CJ, and actually it was MIT Press that would apply for the CJ, the commodities jurisdiction. And either the government would say yes, or they would say no. And if they said yes, that's great, because then we would do the same thing Karn did and apply for another CJ for the floppy disk. But we didn't expect them to say yes. In fact, if they said no, that wasn't so bad either, because then we could make a big stink about it, because they were trying to stop a book from being exported by a major academic press, a prestigious academic press. And actually, MIT wasn't waiting. As soon as they applied for the CJ, they began shipping the books to their sales channels overseas. So they didn't actually wait for permission. So that was actually going to be used at trial if I was indicted in the original, for the original case. But it turns out the government didn't actually say yes or no, they just didn't reply. The reason why they didn't reply was because they were defendants in a civil lawsuit from Phil Karn, and they were afraid of screwing things up for their defense. So they were kind of pinned down. So this was a multi-front war, thank goodness. I think a civil case is a lot more comfortable venue to decide these things instead of a criminal prosecution, because nobody goes to jail in a civil case. So that was the original reason for publishing the source code in a book, and it wasn't really that scannable. The font wasn't that good. But what happened years later when I started a company after the government dropped their case was we really did want to export the source code. And we certainly weren't going to do it the old-fashioned way, the way I did it, by publishing it on the internet. We knew that, you get an electric shock when you get that. So we published it in a book with checksums on every line, and there were three things we had to do to make this book exportable. We had to put it in a public library, which we did. We had to make it available in bookstores, which we did in Palo Alto. And the third thing was that you had to pass it out and make it available at a public conference. Well, it doesn't really matter what kind of conference it was. It could be a conference for, shoe salesmen, It doesn't have to be anything to do with crypto. Well, we didn't know of any shoe salesman conferences, but there was going to be a cypherpunks meeting, so we thought we'd pass it out at the cypherpunks meeting. And, we were sure that those cypherpunks wouldn't do anything like ship those books out of the country. So we had the cypherpunks meeting in the same building that our offices were in, which was a bank building, and so I wanted to have a public record of this meeting so that everyone would know, in case there was if there was a prosecution or something, we could have many witnesses that say exactly what happened at the meeting. That we passed out this book for free, by the way, 5,000 pages of source code. A whole box for each book. And that everyone would clearly remember the events of the meeting. They would be able to say on the witness stand exactly what happened, or say to the press exactly what happened. And so at this meeting, which was a typical cypherpunks meeting with a lot of different business that they had, there was a guy named Lucky Green, who, that's not his real name, but that was his online name. He got up and he announced, this is part of the general announcements for the cypherpunks. It turns out the cypherpunks, I don't know if you folks are familiar with the cypherpunks, but I'm sure you are. It's the Black Hat Conference. They tend to be a bit libertarian, and not just about crypto. So Lucky Green stands up and he says, Well, I'd like to announce the next meeting of the Cypherpunks shooting club. We're going to go out next Saturday and go shooting. And you're all invited to come along if you want to come with us. And he unzips this bag and he pulls out an AR-15 assault rifle. You know, I was keenly aware of the public relations sort of nuances of this battle we were in with the government. And this wasn't really helpful, you know. He could have waited till next week's meeting or something, you know, to talk about this. So that was like the worst possible thing that could happen. I mean, what a dramatic thing. It looked like something out of a movie, you know. He was about to start shooting people. Fortunately, nothing ever happened that required us to call forth all the witnesses that were at that meeting. So anyway, so I'd like to get a few seed questions from the audience to give me some guidance on what you'd like to hear today.
What are your thoughts about the Open PGP project?
The Open PGP project. Well, years ago, when PGP, the first round of PGP, when it was my company, we knew that there would come a time when maybe the company might be sold to another company, and we might lose control of PGP. And so I felt it necessary to launch an escape pod. And so we started a working group in the IETF to make a standard called Open PGP, so that any company could implement to this standard, and that's where it came from. And that was a good thing too, because it turned out to be really necessary when it was in the dark days at NAI. But anyway, there are several companies, small companies, that make products that are compliant with the Open PGP standard. There's GNU Privacy Guard, which is an open source product. There's Hush Communications with Hushmail, which makes perfectly compatible PGP encrypted messages, keys, signatures, and everything. There's Veritas in Belgium. There's a few other companies. If you go to openpgp.org, you can see a list of companies that make products and services that are compatible with PGP. The biggest one now, of course, is PGP Corp, but they still encourage other companies to make things compatible with it. There's a company in Germany that makes OpenPGP compliant software. Glucan-Kanya. They don't have a lot of visibility in the U.S., but I understand that they're pretty visible in Germany. So that's pretty much all I have to say about that. Yeah. Well, yeah, PGP is still a human rights technology project. There's a group called Martis, I believe, that makes technology for human rights groups, and I've been wanting to talk with them, but I just haven't had a chance to sit down with them. So if you know anybody who needs help on that, have them give me a call. If you go to philzimmermann.com, it has all my contact information. Spell Zimmermann with 2 N's, the German spelling, because there's another guy named philzimmermann.com. He has a website too, and he's got a link to my site. Yeah.
What are you planning to do in the next 15 years in terms of improving PGP, especially with the user interface software?
Over the next, how many years? 15 years? Over the next 15 years? Did I hear you say 15 years? Well, it's actually been about 12 years, but yeah. He wants to know what I'm going to do over the next 15 years to improve PGP. Well, the first thing I'd like is that at the end of that time, I definitely expect sky cars. Where are the sky cars? This is the 21st century. We were promised sky cars. So looking ahead to your question, I think, at the end of that time, I want to use whatever money we earned selling PGP and then making improvements to it to buy a Sky car, because I want a Sky car. Well, I don't know that far out, of course, but the biggest thing right now is this increase in usability with this. What they're doing, they're making a proxy server that encrypts and decrypts all the email going in and out of an enterprise, with or without the participation or intervention of the individual employees in that enterprise. So that vastly increases the amount of encrypted email traffic, at least coming from enterprises that buy one of these little boxes. Then we have to reassess whether that solved the usability problem. I think it would, but I thought that adding a GUI to PGP would solve the usability problem, but that didn't. It's hard to look beyond that. I mean, if you're just focusing it only on PGP. Now, if you broaden the question to, how crypto might be applied over the long range, I think crypto will be applied in a lot of things. I think it will become ubiquitous and invisible. All the wireless communication will be encrypted with link encryption. We're going to become increasingly wireless with smaller and smaller cells. There will be ubiquitous computing. Perhaps some of you may have heard of ubiquitous computing, where there's computers everywhere. Well, all that stuff is probably going to be encrypted communications. So encryption will just disappear into the ambient noise. Actually, noise. It does kind of look like noise. It's white, Now, as far as PGP is concerned, there's the market share for PGP is where it should be. It's just that nobody encrypts their email. I think of these two pie charts. If you look at all the email in the world, remember PGP was just for email, so that's why it doesn't apply to where I think most encryption will take place. Like a lot of encryption is taking place with web browsers, with SSL, and that's probably used more than PGP. People don't even realize it's going on. But anyway, all the email in the world, if you make that a pie chart, only a thin sliver is encrypted. But if you take the thin sliver and expand it into a second pie chart of all the encrypted email, nearly the entire pie chart is PGP. Or I should say open PGP, and it's encrypted in that format. There's almost no other format or protocol used for email encryption, despite the fact that there is a big deployment advantage of S/MIME and Microsoft products. I think it comes free with Microsoft Office. So there's more copies of S/MIME floating around out there, but nobody knows that they have them and nobody uses them. And the reason why they don't use them is because of the activation energy required, because you have to have a fully functional public key infrastructure before you can do anything with S/MIME. So that high step function in activation energy required to start using it is too high for most people, most enterprises, and so it never gets used. PGP can be used right out of the box, and that makes it so it's more used, even though there's less of it around. So I'm proud of the second pie chart, but I'm not proud of the first. The first is embarrassingly small, and if you asked me 10 years ago how much encrypted email there would be 10 years in the future, I would have thought it would be most email. Not that I would have predicted that it would all be PGP, that would be too arrogant, and I certainly wouldn't want to do that. Yeah. You're asking if the government's position on encryption would change? Well, I think the government's position on encryption already has changed. We beat them in the 1990s. The crypto revolution is we won, you know. They tried to stop us, both domestically and with export controls. They didn't really have a lot of traction on doing it domestically because of the legal precedents that we had. You know, that people were already, it was already legal to use cryptography domestically. But there were export controls in place, and we had to fight for some years to have them removed. And my case was one of the fronts on that war. Plus, there was also the civil litigation of Phil Karn and Dan Bernstein. And then, so we had things in the courts, we had things in the legislation. There were several legislative initiatives to do it. And finally, the executive branch did it unilaterally because they were afraid that the courts or the Congress would usurp the decision from the president. And the export controls were lifted at the end of the Clinton administration. So maybe it's because maybe it's because an election was coming, and whoever wins the election would certainly have to win California. But there hasn't been any significant erosion of the use of cryptography, or rather, the government hasn't tried to suppress cryptography domestically, and it hasn't shown any signs of turning back on the export controls. And I think one reason for that is John Ashcroft was a senator during the time that we were debating this in Congress. And although there are many things I disagree with John Ashcroft about, at least that one issue, he was on our side of the issue. And so he didn't change his position when he became Attorney General, at least not for export controls. And, you know, the intelligence agencies kind of resigned themselves to the wave of the future. They did that before the FBI did. I think the FBI probably still would like to see that turn back. But the NSA recognized that it was a lost cause long before the FBI did. So I don't think we're going to lose the ability to encrypt. Now, what might happen is rather than restricting the use of cryptography, I think that it's possible we might see some effort by the government to force you to give up your private key if you're, if you're the target of a criminal investigation. You may be asked to give up your private key, and if you refuse to do so, that might add to the legal problems that you have. This is already being done in Britain, although I don't know how well that's been tested. It's my experience that that under stress you might forget your passphrase. I forget things all the time. I actually thought that might come up in my own case, and I have forgotten a lot of passphrases. Actually, you really can honestly forget your passphrase for some things, because, I mean, if you're going to use a key every day, then you're probably going to remember that one. But, you know, you might have passphrases on other things that you don't use every day. For example, you might have a PGP disk volume or something like that that just requires a passphrase just for this one thing. And unless you use the same passphrase that you use for your normal key, you might forget it. I actually have several PGP disk volumes that I've had around for like 5 years. And I can't, for the life of me, remember the passphrase. I don't even remember what's in them anymore. And, you know, I've racked my brains trying to think of this. And, you know, I mean, I get mail from people all the time asking me what to do when they forget their passphrase. And I write back, well, ask psychic friends. So that's kind of a dangerous thing about cryptography. But it also means that, you know, there's some interesting legal questions of what happens if governments, such as Great Britain, or maybe in the future the US, tries to require you to give up your passphrase or your private key in a criminal proceeding. Yeah. Well, it's not going to go with more hardware, it's going to be software. You know, everything is software. You know, traditionally, historically, the NSA, the question was, is over the next few years, is crypto going to be going toward more hardware or software? Now, historically, the NSA used exclusively hardware. They didn't trust software for very good reason, since all of you are in the business of dealing with problems of computers being broken into. I don't have to explain to you why hardware, dedicated crypto hardware, is more secure. But the economics drive the customers towards software. You know, there's just not enough of these big, clunky, secure phones to give to everybody that needs them. So you need software. Now, there are more smart cards being used all the time. But, you know, I don't know if you call that, if that's hardware. Still, most of it's taking place on a PC. Yeah? Well, that was the question is, during the 1990s debate, the debate, one of the most important assertions of the debate on one side of the debate was that pedophiles and terrorists would use encryption. And maybe the question is, well, maybe that's true, and what are the implications of that? Well, you know, that was the central question of the debate, in fact. And during that debate, at no time did I ever deny that criminals would use PGP. In fact, not just cryptography, but PGP in particular. A lot of people were saying, oh, there's no evidence that the bad guys are using PGP, but I know that they do use PGP. But, you know, we went through a lengthy, exhaustive debate through the 1990s. And that debate had expert participation from all quarters. There was the courts, there was Congress, the executive branch, the NSA, the FBI, journalists, civil libertarians, people from academia. Everybody was involved in that debate. And it took years. It took years, and it was a tough debate. And that question that you raised was the central question of the debate. And yet, through the years, we came to a decision as a society that society is better off with strong encryption than without it, even knowing that criminals and terrorists could use encryption. Excuse me. And so I think it was a good decision. And I wish the criminals and terrorists did not use encryption. I wish, in particular, they didn't use PGP. But they do. And even the worst bad guys that we face today, the worst ones that have twisted our society the way it has, they use it. But, you know, you have to look at the big picture of everyone using this technology. It's saved a lot of lives around the world. I get email from human rights groups. I put a couple of samples of that on my website. If you go to philzimmermann.com, you can read examples of how PGP has saved lives in other places around the world. It's been used in combat in Kosovo. I didn't put that one on the website. I didn't get permission from the guy who wrote to me, but it was used in a situation where there were 8,000 civilians trapped in a valley surrounded by Serbs, and they used PGP to coordinate extracting them. And, you know, that could have turned into another mass grave. You know, I keep talking about my website. On my website, there's a real audio news report of when the government dropped their case against me, but it's from National Public Radio. And immediately following that, is another report about a mass grave in Bosnia. And so, it's kind of interesting that those two news items were back to back. And I see it as that's really what this is about. There's the same kinds of tensions that exist in the Western democracies between criminals using encryption and the police trying to stop them, is, at least from a technical perspective, not a political perspective, but from a technical perspective, that's indistinguishable from a human rights worker in an oppressive country using that, because he's breaking the law there, and it's the police that are trying to stop him. So technically, it's hard to think how to build something that will serve this need without also inadvertently serving this, quote, need, unquote. But I think that, we have to stick with our decision. It's a decision that we made with our eyes open. We didn't have 9/11 to guide us, but we had the knowledge that, certainly the expert participation in that debate had the knowledge that things like 9/11 could happen. Yeah.
Given your original motivations of political activism, given where you can see some sampling of such technologies or might be able to board readers and all sorts of things like that, given the additional notion that crypto can be used for security, but crypto isn't security, what's your thoughts on the sense of relevance of cryptography as we move into the future, specifically with regard to technologically superior governments/states? In other words, in places like China and some other places that have a whole series of laws and technical means, is cryptography even relevant anymore, or at some point in the future would it be relevant?
That's a great question. I don't know how to distill it in one sentence. I wish there were more microphones in the audience. The question is cryptography a panacea? You didn't put it that way, but that's the drift I get. To solve all security problems with computers, and of course it's not. To the lay public, cryptography seems to be the central technology, that if you have strong cryptography, you don't need anything else, that equals data security. But at this conference, everybody knows that that's not true. It's like having a fence, a picket fence. I saw I think it was at the Computers, Freedom, and Privacy Conference, somebody showed a slide with a picket fence around a house. And one picket was 200 miles high. And that's cryptography, And if you have a longer key, then it's even higher, And so, does that keep people out? It's kind of like that toll booth in the desert in Blazing Saddles. So no, cryptography is not the place that they're going to attack. They're going to come in with keyboard sniffers, for example. There are all kinds of opportunities for your opponent to get your stuff. You can have keyboard sniffers. You can plant microphones in your office. You can have video cameras at airports that are just there for other reasons. Airport video cameras are not there to capture passphrases while you type them, but they could do that. Maybe if you're at an airport in a foreign country. If you do a lot of foreign travel and you're in a country that isn't very friendly, and you're typing your passphrase on your laptop while you're waiting for your flight, maybe they'll get your passphrase. The French have stolen laptops from hotel rooms for people attending the Paris Air Show. That's the anecdotal stories I've heard. There's that mafia guy, Nicky Scarfo, who was caught because the feds put a keyboard sniffer on his computer so they could capture his PGP passphrase. He was using PGP. And they didn't break it cryptanalytically. They broke it by getting his passphrase with a keyboard sniffer. I shouldn't say the mafia guy, the alleged mafia guy. First thing I'd recommend to his defense lawyer is to change the name of his client, you know. So, yeah, that's one giant picket. Yeah. I don't really think of PGP as being that important for stopping spam, at least not the encryption functions. You might be able to do something with the digital signatures, but the way in which you would use it for the digital signatures would involve a kind of an active challenge response thing, or you would, maybe not challenge response, but you would have to have all the good emails signed, and I think that's too heavy a burden because you know, there's always going to be a lot of important email that isn't signed that's going to be turned away by overzealous spam filters. Am I out? You know, I haven't seen any of the other things you held up. This is, yeah. I see. See, that's because I'm short, you know, I can't see over the thing. All right, so I'm out of time, apparently. All right. See, if I'd known that, I would have tried to put more politically inspiring stuff in. A lot of you work for the federal government, I'm told, and I'd like to just say, to the extent that you have some policy execution flexibility, please let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater in our zeal to catch the terrorist. We've had an erosion of our civil liberties. We've had the worst erosion of our civil liberties in history in the last couple of years. So we got to do something about that. Thanks.